Good evening, everyone. We are going to discuss three important questions from December 2019 paper. So it is about, the first question is about gait disorders. The second one is about diagnosis and treatment of obstructive sleep apnea. And the third one is about malabsorption syndrome that we'll be having in a further slides. So let's begin with the first question for the day, that is about gait disorders, right? So that's a very important topic from neurology, and that is also important for practicals. So let us begin with the topic of gait disorders. It was asked as a 4-marker question, and they're asked about the etiology of gait disorders, right? So how to attempt this question, what are the types of gaits and their etiologies? We'll briefly see how to attempt this question and understand gait better. So talking of gait disorders, gait disorders are a common cause of falls and injury in elderly patients. Okay. More than 65 years of age, around 15% of individuals will be having a gait disorder. And at more than 80 years of age, almost 25% of individuals will be having a gait disorder. And more than 85% of age, or about 40% of individuals will be having a gait disorder. So clearly it's an age-related process as well. As the person ages, the gait disorders start to set in. So we'll see in further slides, as well as we shall have discussion regarding what are the types of gaits and what are their etiologies, right? So just remember this figure, that around 15% of individuals at 65 years of age, 25% of individuals at 80 years of age, and more than 85 years, around 40% of individuals will have one or the other gait disorder. Okay. So we must know what are the key components of the gait. The key components of the gait are composed of muscles, bones, joints, ligaments, tendons, you can write also, and nervous system, that is the central nervous system, right? These are the key components of the gait. Okay, so we are not going into the parts of the gait right now for this question. We are just focusing on the types of gaits and their etiology. Okay, so all of them work in sync for the formation of our gait. So let us discuss briefly about the CNS functions. CNS functions has been told to be divided into 3 parts. That is sensory integration, that involves visual, vestibular, proprioceptive receptors. Second step is motor planning. Third step is motor execution. So we receive input through our senses, that could be visual, vestibular, or a proprioceptive input. The second step is of motor planning, when the locomotor centers in the pontine tegmentum, okay, midbrain and subthalamic region, they decide for what action is to be taken, for what motor command is to be given. And actual motor execution occurs through the corticospinal tracts. Those are the descending pathways in the ventromedial spinal cord. So these are the CNS parts. These are the parts in the central nervous system, or the steps in the central nervous system, that are important for the formation of gait. So as we have discussed, gait disorder may result from any step of the above discussed pathways may be disturbed. So there may be an insult in the peripheral sensory system. Okay, there may be an insult in the peripheral sensory system, like there might be visual loss, okay, or there might be vestibular deficit, or there might be peripheral neuropathy. So all of them hinder in the peripheral or sensory inputs and might result in a gait disorder. Okay. So let us jump into our question. This was briefly about the introduction. Let us jump into our question that is asking us about the etiology of gait disorders. So remember, while we are talking of gait disorders, there are various types of gaits that we have been studying. So the etiology will depend upon the type of gait that we are talking about. So let's begin with the first type, that is called cautious gait. Cautious gait is the one wherein the patient would be having a wide base of walking. Okay, the patient would be having a wide base of walking. There will be short strides or short steps. Okay. There would be lowered center of mass. That means the patient might walk with a stoop and arms are abducted. Arms are abducted. Okay, so that is called a cautious gait. So it is generally seen in older individuals, in old age patients, and it is idiopathic. There is no specific reason for the same, and this is an idiopathic kind of gait. That is the first kind of gait that we are discussing about. This kind of gait is present in more than 1/3 of the elderly patients or the older patients. Okay. The second type of gait that we are discussing is the spastic or the stiff-legged gait, as indicated by the name. This kind of gait results from an upper motor neuron kind of lesion. That may be an ischemic stroke, intracranial hemorrhage, or that might be congenital in some cases like cerebral palsy. All right. So there is compromise of the corticospinal command because it's an upper motor neuron lesion. So such patients have a tendency to circumduct their feet. So this kind of gait can also be called as circumduction. You must have heard of circumduction gait when you have been discussing cases about CV strokes. So upper motor neuron signs would be present. Just remember, this kind of gait is called spastic or stiff-legged gait, and the cause is upper motor neuron lesion. One point to remember is regarding scissoring gait. So you might be reading in various books about scissoring gait as a type of spastic gait. So this is a kind of gait where due to extreme spasticity, the legs, they cross each other. The legs would cross each other due to extreme stiffness, right? The legs would cross each other due to extreme stiffness. So that is known as scissoring gait. So you can just remember it as a part of UMN lesion. So I hope this was clear about cautious gait and spastic gait. Next gait is about freezing gait. So we all know about freezing gait. Freezing gait is a kind of gait where there is brief episodic absence of forward progression. So there is brief and episodic absence of forward progression. So patient is not able to initiate or progress the gait. That is known as freezing gait. So we all know freezing gait is seen in Parkinsonism or progressive supranuclear palsy, multisystem atrophy, or CBD, that is corticobasal degeneration. So those are Parkinson plus syndromes. So those are the typical cases where there is absence of forward progression despite the intention to walk. So patient does have an intention to walk, but there is no forward progression. Okay, so it is present in 25% of patients within 5 years of the onset of Parkinson disease. Just remember, 25% of patients will develop freezing kind of gait within first 5 years of the onset of disease. Okay, so that is known as freezing gait. Next one is about frontal gait. So frontal gait, as indicated by the name, is the gait resulting from disorders of in the frontal lobe of our brain. That might be a vascular encephalopathy involving the arteries, That might be NPH, that stands for normal pressure hydrocephalus. Normal pressure hydrocephalus. I expect from you people to give me in the chat box the typical triad for normal pressure hydrocephalus, NPH triad. Okay, that is important for your MCQs. Then it might be caused due to severe dementia or frontal lobe masses. So what kind of gait is actually frontal gait? It is quite similar to the cautious gait, wherein the patient has a wide base of walking. The patient walks with a wide base. There are shorter strides. And there is difficulty in starts and turns. That is known as frontal gait. So there is difficulty in initiation of the gait as well in frontal kind of a gait. So that is sometimes known as slipping clutch syndrome. Or that is also known as gait ignition failure. So these are the terminologies that have been used to describe a frontal kind of a gait where there is difficulty in initiation of the gait. So it is slightly different from the freezing kind of a gait where there is also difficulty or absence of absolute forward progression. Patient might be able to initiate but not able to progress. That is freezing kind. The patient gets freezed. And in frontal gait, there is difficulty in initiation of the gait as well. That is why these special names have been given. That is called slipping clutch syndrome or gait ignition failure. That is a kind of gait. That is when we are talking of frontal gait. So they are seen this kind of a gait is seen in vascular encephalopathy, NPH, severe dementia, and frontal masses. Right. So let me tell you the triad for NPH as well. The typical triad for NPH is number 1, that is urinary incontinence. Okay. Number 2 is mental changes. And number 3 is frontal kind of a gait. Okay. So you can remember that as well. So this is the 4th kind of a gait that we have discussed so far. I hope I am able to make myself clear. Next kind of a gait is cerebellar ataxic gait. So what kind of a gait is cerebellar ataxic gait? So obviously it is seen in cerebellar disorders like cerebellar stroke, cereballitis, multiple sclerosis, trauma, or chronic alcohol abuse. So how do you describe a cerebellar ataxia, gait ataxia? So again, there is a wide base of walking. The patient would have a wide base of walking. There will be lateral instability of trunk, lateral trunk instability. Remember, there will be a truncal sway. That is called truncal sway. That is laterally unstable trunk. Patient would sway to the left or right. That is lateral instability. There would be erratic foot placements and there would be no tandem walk. So absence of tandem walking. What is tandem walking? Tandem walking is a kind of walk where we walk heel to toe. So you must have seen in your clinics, we ask the patient to walk by touching their toes and heels of one foot followed by the other. That is known as tandem walk. Loss of tandem walk is a typical feature of cerebellar gait ataxia, right? The next one is sensory ataxia. So what is sensory ataxia? It is basically seen in conditions like diabetic neurosyphilis. So you all know about TAFE dorsalis in case of neurosyphilis, or vitamin B12 deficiency. Classical example of sensory ataxia. So how is it different from cerebellar ataxia? What are the features of sensory ataxia? So patient does have an unstable stance while standing with closed eyes. So if the patient is asked to walk in a dark room, okay, ask to stand in a dark room or stand with closed eye, there would be an unstable stance. Patient would not be able to stand properly, right? So when such patients walk, they generally look down upon their feet while they are walking, and it is due to involvement of large sensory fibers. Large sensory fibers, mostly they're ascending in the posterior column. So large sensory fibers get affected before a sensory kind of ataxia sets in. Large sensory fibers are responsible for joint position and proprioception. All of us know that, right? So this is what we have been talking of, sensory ataxia. That is the main point of difference. When we block the visual input, the patient is not able to maintain the balance. That is sensory ataxia, involvement of large fibers. Next one is about vestibular ataxic gait. So it is because vestibular ataxia is a tendency to fall forward or backward. That is due to involvement of the vestibule, that is in the middle ear. That may be due to some vestibulopathy or neuronitis, Meniere's disease, that may be seen in Meniere's disease, or acoustic neuroma. Okay, so all these kinds lead to an unstable gait that is known as vestibular ataxic gait. Okay, I hope this much is clear to all. So coming on next is the high steppage gait. So high steppage gait, we all know, it is seen in patients having distal weakness in cases of peripheral neuropathy. In cases of peripheral neuropathy. So patient walks with lifting of the foot high up in the air due to foot drop. To compensate for the foot drop, right? You all know that patient lifts their leg high up in the air to compensate for the foot drop that has occurred because of the peripheral neuropathy, is known as high steppage gait. Right? Then the gait disorder might be just a psychogenic phenomena that may be due to a preceding stress or trauma or PTSD as a part of PTSD. So the characteristic of a psychogenic kind of a gait is that this kind of gait is sudden onset. There is no insidious period. Then there are the deficits are inconsistent, that might change on one day and they might be different on the other day. That is inconsistent deficits. The deficits might be having a waxing and waning kind of a course. Okay, one day your patient might be walking absolutely comfortably, and the other day the patient might be having difficulty in walking, and they improve with distraction. So those are the kinds of features that help you distinguish from a neurological kind of a gait disorder. So what is Aspasia, Astasia? Astasia, Aspasia. I want to know from all of you in the comments. That is Astasia, Aspasia. What is this? So this question is more important for MCQs rather than your practical point of view, but you should be aware. So I'm waiting for you to write it in comments, right? So what is the last kind of etiology is others, or you can write it as miscellaneous. This is due to the effects of certain drugs like sedatives, neuroleptics, benzodiazepines, or in patients of chronic renal failure, hepatic failure, where they might land up in encephalopathies, right? So out of all of the types of gait disorders that we have discussed, the kind of gait disorders that are actually reversible are due to vitamin B12 deficiency, that is sensory ataxic gait, or those occurring as a side effect of certain drugs, or the psychogenic ones. So those are the kinds of gaits that are actually reversible. So this was a 4-marker question. So I hope you were able to understand how to attempt this question. I will quickly take you through the slides once again. It was a 4-marker question where we introduced about the gait disorders, how common they are. Then we talked about the CNS functions, which involves 3 parts: sensory integration, motor planning, motor execution. Then we talked about the etiologies. So we described each kind of a gait. We described about 8 to 10 kinds of gaits, their main important causes, and the characteristic features in each kind of gait that we have discussed. Hope you all have noted down the points, right? Cautious gait, spastic gait, freezing, frontal, cerebellar ataxic, sensory ataxic, vestibular, high steppage gait, psychogenic, and other causes. So this is how you can attempt to a question of etiologies of gait disorder. So I hope this was clear to all. So before we move on to the next topic, I would like to tell you that when we talk of gait as a topic in clinical medicine, there is a lot to discuss about gaits yet. Okay, we have not discussed about the parts of the gait. We have not discussed about a few other things as well. So we shall rather discuss them in CNS classes when we take up your practical crash course. So those will be discussed in your clinical CNS classes. So I hope you must have enrolled for those classes. Those will be really helpful to you. So we are just discussing the theory questions in these classes. Your practical based questions will be taken up in your practical crash course. Right. So I hope you all know about the beginning of crash courses as well. They're about to begin in few days. So the next question again from the December 2019 exam was about obstructive sleep apnea. This was a 6-marker question, 3+3, wherein they asked about the diagnosis and treatment of obstructive sleep apnea, OSA, right? So before we directly jump on to the diagnosis and treatment, we need to know a bit about the introduction and few important points from this topic we shall discuss. So what is OSA, obstructive sleep apnea, is defined as on the basis of nocturnal and daytime symptoms as well as sleep study findings. Number 1, sleep study findings. And number 2, on the basis of symptoms, that may be nocturnal and daytime. Second point, either symptoms of nocturnal breathing disturbances, that is snoring, snorting, gasping, or breathing pauses during the sleep. So you all know the meaning of snoring. Snorting means actually kind of sniffing kind of a behavior, as if a patient is taking small breaths. Gasping, or patient might be having breathing pauses during the sleep. So all of this despite sufficient opportunity to sleep and unexplained by any other medical condition, right? So patient has got enough opportunity to sleep, and despite that, patient was having breathing pauses or nocturnal breathing disturbances that constitutes as a part of nocturnal symptoms, right? We shall discuss in detail in further slides as well. So just remember, if there are more than or equal to 5 episodes of apnea or hypopnea per hour of sleep, that counts as obstructive sleep apnea. So I'll briefly discuss about apnea, hypopneas, the AHI, and what about these episodes of sleep. I'll briefly discuss in further slides. This was just an introductory page. So you can start your question with these introductory points. All right. So I would like you to know about what is apnea, what is hypopnea, right? So apnea is cessation or stoppage of airflow for more than 10 seconds, which is accompanied by a persistent respiratory effort, that is known as obstructive sleep apnea. If there is absence of respiratory effort, that is known as central sleep apnea, right? So airflow ceasing for more than or equal to 10 seconds, that is apnea, right? But if there is reduction in the airflow by more than 30%, there is not complete cessation of airflow, but more than 30% reduction in airflow for at least 10 seconds, right? That is accompanied by a more than 3% desaturation or a cortical brain arousal. So patient is rising up from sleep, or there is desaturation in the oximeter. That is known as hypopnea. That is, there is 30% reduction in the airflow. And what is RERA? That is respiratory effort related arousals, where there is partial obstruction that does not meet the criteria for hypopnea but provides an evidence for increasing inspiratory effort. That is known as RERA, or respiratory effort related arousals. So it is important for you to know these definitions. There was nothing to improvise. So these are the definitions that have been taken up from textbooks, and we are supposed to remember them as such, right? So I hope you've understood what is apnea, what is hypopnea, and what is RERA, right? So based upon these understandings, we shall now discuss What do you understand by apnea hypopnea index? That is written as AHI. AHI stands for apnea hypopnea index. So you must be aware of this hypopnea index. Okay, you must be aware of this index as well. So what do you mean by apnea hypopnea index? That is number of episodes of apnea and hypopnea. Apnea and hypopnea divided by number of hours of sleep. Number of hours of sleep. That is known as AHI or apnea hypopnea index, right? That is known as apnea hypopnea index. So number of episodes of apnea plus hypopnea divided by number of hours of sleep is AHI. There is something known as RDI, that stands for respiratory disturbance index. Respiratory disturbance index, RDI. What does RDI stand for? That stands for number of episodes of apnea plus hypopnea plus RERAs. That is respiratory effort related arousal. So I hope you remember RERAs. That is the kind of breathing disturbance that is not meeting the criteria for hypopnea, but it is associated with arousal. That is RERA. So all of this divided by number of hours of sleep, right? So that is giving you an AHI and RDI, number of hours of sleep. So that is giving you AHI and RDI, that is respiratory disturbance index. Okay, so to classify obstructive sleep apnea into mild, moderate and severe, we have to know what is the AHI of the patient. So an AHI which is between 5 to 14. So if the number of episodes are between 5 to 14 per hour, that is known as mild OSA. If the episodes are in 15 to 29 per hour or 15 to 29 events per hour, that is moderate, and for severe OSA the episodes have to be more than equal to 30. That is a case of severe OSA, right? So that is about the classification of obstructive sleep apnea, right? So moving on, let us now dive into our question, which is about the diagnosis and management of obstructive sleep apnea. So for diagnosis, we need three things. It has to be diagnosed on the basis of symptoms and history, or physical examination or physical findings and laboratory findings, right? These are the three steps in our diagnosis. So very easy to understand. What points shall you ask in history, right? So the patient there is a proper nocturnal sleep history has to be obtained. If there is history of snoring, gasping or snorting. Snorting is just like sniffing when we are taking shorter breaths. In the absence of dyspnea. So remember, there should be no dyspnea. If there is dyspnea, that could go into PND or some other disorders, but there should be no dyspnea. And there are frequent nighttime awakenings. That is, nocturnal sleep history is important, which is generally obtained from the room partner. Then there is history of excessive daytime sleepiness, where the patients have involuntary periods of daytime dozing off. And there is difficulty in maintaining alertness. Patient cannot maintain alertness levels, and because of this there are excessive fatigue, irritability and mood disturbances. I hope you're able to note down side by side. I'm not going very fast, also I'm not going very slow, just going at an optimum pace. So I hope you're able to note down the points. And the third important point in history is about dry mouth, nocturnal heartburns or diaphoresis. So those are all results of nocturnal awakenings and mouth breathing basically. So those are the points in history that you will see, right? Nocturnal sleep history, excessive daytime sleepiness, and history of nocturnal heartburn or diaphoresis or dry mouth that generally occur as a part of obstructive sleep apnea. Okay. talking of the points in physical examination, just remember there are certain risk factors for the development of obstructive sleep apnea. So when we are talking of the physical examination, remember how would we proceed for the physical examination? First thing, we would look for obesity. That is the most important risk factor as well. So when we're examining the patient, we'll evaluate the patient whether they're obese or not. Most of the time it is clearly obvious. So just remember a few points about obesity. Obesity is the risk factor for OSA in more than 50% of the OSA cases, right? So it comprises more than 50% of OSA cases are due to obesity. Number 2, remember obese people are at 4 times higher risk for OSA compared to non-obese individuals. There is 4 times higher risk. Remember, okay? Number 3, a 10% weight gain. A 10% gain in weight would result in a 30% increased risk of OSA. Increased risk of OSA. Okay, so all these points are important for your MCQs as well. Remember, we are just discussing physical examination. Where you will look for signs whether the patient is obese or not. They calculate the BMI and find out what kind of obesity is the patient having. But all these points are important for you to understand for MCQ point of view. Also remember the male pattern of obesity. The male pattern of obesity is particularly more prone to develop OSA, right? So male pattern of obesity is particularly more prone to develop OSA. Just a second. So because there will be decreased chest wall compliance and decreased lung volume, so male patterns of obesity are also more prone to development of obesity, right? So this was the first point in physical examination. Second point that you are going to mention is about examination of oropharynx. So why is it so? Because the pharyngeal wall are usually easily collapsible when we are talking of obstructive sleep apnea. So evaluation of oropharynx is important, wherein we might witness an enlarged tongue. That might be the cause of OSA. There might be an enlarged tongue. Number 2, there might be a low-lying soft palate. The soft palate might be low-lying, right? The uvula soft palate might be low-lying. The uvula might be bulky. Okay, that might be causing difficulty in breathing or obstructive symptoms. There might be bulky or large tonsils. So that is the problem may be at the level of soft palate or tongue or tonsils. There might be a high arched palate, or there might be high arched palate, or there might be micrognathia or retrognathia. Okay, the mandible might be small or backwards. That is retrognathia or micrognathia, right? So these are the points in physical examination for the oropharynx. Okay. Number 3 is about neurological examination. So why are we examining the nervous system? That is neurological examination. So it is important to rule out conditions like neuromuscular disorders or cerebrovascular diseases. So we have to perform a neurological examination as well to rule out that as a cause of breathing disturbances. And number 4 would be a cardiac or CVS examination, that is basically done to have an estimate of the right ventricle and left ventricular functions. So cardiac functions ke liye we do the cardiac examination. This is done to rule out cor pulmonale that might be occurring secondary to OSA. Okay. So these are the 4 points in physical examination that you can mention. Just to mention for your knowledge, the other risk factors for development of OSA other than obesity are: number 1, male gender, they're more prone to development of OSA, and number 2, older age. Other than that, there can be certain genetic disorders like Turner syndrome that might be more prone to development, or there might be oropharyngeal anatomical defects like we have already discussed in our examination slide, oropharyngeal anatomical defects, right? So this is in brief about the physical examination part. I hope I am able to make myself clear and you're able to follow the points. Okay. Then after physical examination, we have to talk about laboratory findings before we can come to a conclusion of obstructive sleep apnea, right? So talking of laboratory findings, we know that the gold standard investigation for the diagnosis of obstructive sleep apnea is polysomnography, or commonly known as the sleep study. Polysomnography, that is the gold standard for diagnosis. Remember, it may be false negative in cases of insufficient REM or supine sleep. So that has to be done in a standardized lab. That is about polysomnography. Remember, if the patient is not able to go to the lab, there are options for home sleep study as well, which are more cost effective, and that can be done right in the comfort of a home, of the patient's home, and that is done with the help of a portable machine. Okay, that is done with the help of a portable machine. So there are certain parameters that are monitored in a sleep study. Well, I'll show you those parameters. What are those parameters in one of the further slides. Just remember, these are the two investigations that you perform to diagnose a case of obstructive sleep apnea. Other than these, there are few other investigations like MRI or CT of the upper airways to look for any oropharyngeal defects. Then there can be you can perform an blood pressure monitoring overnight and observe that there will be nocturnal non-dipping. So nocturnal non-dipping of blood pressure, that signifies patient has developed hypertension as a result of OSA or vice versa. And also go for ABG measurements to look for evidences of hypoxia and hemoglobin measurements that might alter as a result of hypoxia or chronic hypoxia. So I wanted to show you the slide that is regarding components of the sleep study. So whenever you get a sleep study in your hand and you get to interpret the sleep studies, always remember these are the components of a sleep study or a polysomnography report. So they will be giving you regarding the number of AHIs, RDIs and RERAs, right? So we have already discussed in detail about what is AHI, what is RDI and what is RERA, and the number of these events would be mentioned in the sleep study report. That is point number 1. Second, they will be mentioning about the profile of oxygen saturation, about the mean value, the nadir value and also the lowest value, the highest value, lowest value and the mean value. So what has been the profile of oxygen saturation? Third point is about sleep latency. That is, sleep latency is how long did it take for the person to fall asleep after hitting the bed. So that is how long has the initiation of sleep taken. That is known as sleep latency. That is quantified, right? Number 4 is frequency of periodic limb movements. How often was the patient moving his or her limbs? Then what is sleep efficiency? It stands for the percentage of time when the patient was actually asleep. When the patient was actually asleep out of the time he spent in bed. So the percentage of time the patient was sleeping out of the time he spent in bed. That is sleep efficiency. Then arousal index is number of times the patient has aroused during the sleep, how many arousal episodes have taken place, and whether there was REM sleep or light sleep or not. So that is about the components of a sleep study. Okay, so not important for this particular question, just important for general knowledge. So I wanted you to know. these are the other investigations that we had been discussing about. Now coming on to the treatment part, right? So there can be preventive therapies or there can be preventive or there could be therapeutic approach. So when we are talking of preventive therapies, we have to identify and address the lifestyle and behavior related issues. There is management of obesity because that's an important risk factor. There is management of sleep schedules and durations. Eliminate alcohol ingestion and minimize the use of opioid or sedative medicines. So you can mention about addressing the lifestyle and behavioral issues that might be related directly to obesity or any other risk factor for OSA. Management of obesity, management of sleep schedules and duration, alcohol ingestion should be eliminated, and the use of opioid or sedative medications should be minimized. That is the preventive aspect. So I hope you were able to note it down. So coming on to the therapeutic aspects of obstructive sleep apnea, remember the standard therapy with highest efficacy for the management of obstructive sleep apnea is CPAP therapy. CPAP stands for continuous positive airway pressure. I hope all of you know the full form, that is continuous positive airway pressure. Continuous positive airway pressure. I'll show you a picture how is CPAP given, you'll understand it better. It acts as a mechanical splint for maintaining airway patency. So that's a mechanical splint that is important for maintaining airway patency. The beneficial effects are on the alertness, mood, quality of life, and cardiovascular outcomes. So CPAP is the standard therapy with highest proven efficacy for the management of or treatment of obstructive sleep apnea. Okay. So this is a typical CPAP device and the patient has to keep it overnight, and that is acting as a mechanical splint to keep the airways open. So the picture is self-explanatory. I hope I'm able to make it clear. Coming on to the next part, that is oral appliances and uvulopalatopharyngoplasty. So what is about oral appliances? This is regarding repositioning of lower jaws and tongue to open up the airways and causes 50%, more than 50% reduction in AHI. So remember, the oral appliances, they help in reposition your lower jaw. So this is not an actual surgical procedure, just with the help of certain appliances. The lower jaw, in cases of mandibular or maxillary disorders, that can be repositioned to keep the airways open. Then it is about the surgical management, which includes uvulopalatopharyngoplasty. It is useful and beneficial, usually beneficial for patients with mild OSA, but not so effective for patients with severe OSA. So remember, severe OSA patients would not really respond to uvulopalatopharyngoplasty. Remember that. Okay. So other than these are the traditional therapeutic options that we have been discussing for a long time. There are certain newer options also, like injection of a hardening agent to the soft palate. So that will help in maintaining the patency of the soft palate better. So prevent it from collapsing. So that is about injection of a hardening agent. Or there could be radiofrequency ablation of the oropharyngeal components that are causing increased collapsibility. There could be injection of palatal implants, or there could be upper airway neurostimulation. So basically, this is just unilateral stimulation of the hypoglossal nerve, right? Unilateral stimulation of hypoglossal nerve that helps in keeping the oropharynx, the pharyngeal part near the tongue, that is helping to keep it patent when we have stimulated the 12th nerve. So that is regarding the newer options that are available for the management of obstructive sleep apnea. Right? So I hope I was able to make myself clearer. Once again, I'll briefly take you through the slides. The question was regarding diagnosis and treatment of obstructive sleep apnea. We briefly introduced about OSA, what is it? We briefly told about few terms. Those are apnea, hypopnea, and RDIs and RERAs. Then we talked about what is AHI, what is RDI. We talked about those. Then we talked about the diagnosis, wherein we talked about the symptoms and history part. Few points in physical examination that I have told you already, and then few points from the laboratory findings in the form of sleep studies. This was a format regarding the components of a sleep study. When you get a PSG report, you get points in this format. Few other investigations, and then about the management or treatment, which includes the preventive and therapeutic aspects of obstructive sleep apnea. So that is all about this question.